Russian forces unleashed a new attack across cities in Ukraine in the dead of the night after that nearly 2-hour phone call that happened earlier between Presidents Trump and Putin, a call that ended without Russia agreeing to a 30-day pause on all fighting, something that Ukraine had agreed to. The Russian leader did agree to lay off hitting targets like Ukraine's energy grid or its power plants. But of course, important to note with that spares Putin's energy infrastructure as well. And when you look closely at the two readouts that we got today, one from the White House and one from the Kremlin of the call, the differences are obvious. For example, the Kremlin says that it pointed out that a complete cessation of providing Kyiv with foreign military aid and intelligence must become the key condition for preventing an escalation of the conflict and making progress towards its resolution, aka no more military aid or intel sharing to Ukraine. But the White House didn't mention that demand to stop military aid from the call, and Trump said tonight they didn't talk about it.
No, he didn't. We didn't talk about aid, actually. We didn't talk about aid at all. We talked about a lot of things, but aid was never discussed.
My sources on all of this are the former Deputy Director of National Intelligence, Beth Sanner, and the former NATO Supreme Allied Commander, Admiral James Stavridis, who has a new book called The Admiral's Bookshelf. And it's great to have you both here. Beth, when you look at this and the two different readouts here in terms of what this looks like, what does it say to you that one mentions stopping military aid, Trump says they didn't talk about it, and just in general, what were your takeaways from the 2-hour call?
I mean, look, we are looking at the very top of the iceberg, right, in terms of these readouts. We're only getting maybe, I don't know, 0.01% of what this 2-hour call was, half for translation. But nonetheless, we don't actually know what happened, do we? So I don't know if that's true or not that they didn't talk about that. I think that there was probably quite a bit that was discussed. But I think that the main thing I take away from this is that there is one person who's driving the terms of this negotiation. It is not Donald Trump. It is President Putin. Because if we were taking us back a week ago where we left Marco Rubio saying we're going to present Russia with an unconditional ceasefire and we'll see which one of these countries is a problem for peace. Well, we just found out, but instead he got praise. So these are all Putin's terms.
Admiral Stavridis, how do you see this in terms of, Trump said tonight the next step is a full ceasefire, but do you believe the Kremlin appears to be any closer to that from that 0.01% of the readout that we got, as Beth put it?
Yeah, I think Beth's background at the CIA is showing, and I think she's right, which is to say Putin is kind of playing rope-a-dope here. He's going to try and do everything he can to appease Donald Trump, but at the same time, he really does not want to give up what he perceives, I think correctly at the moment, is a military advantage. So what is he going to do? He'll agree to what is, frankly, a kind of a minor ceasefire sliver of, okay, I won't go after infrastructure, I won't go after electric grid. We'll see. He's launching missiles right now. On the other hand, the big ceasefire, that's still a chimera glimmering off in the distance. Putin is just playing the table right now.
And Admiral, what does it mean for the fighting on the ground, actually, with what Russia did agree to in terms of, Ukraine had actually been making progress on that front, on hitting Russia. So what does this mean for what happens on the ground right now?
Well, let's start with that terrible 5 days where the U.S. ceased supplying weapons, but I think more importantly, Beth will agree with this, with supplying intelligence. That's like taking a boxer in the ring and dropping a full court mask across his or her face. You can't fight if you can't see. So I think as long as we keep the intelligence flowing, we can keep the Ukrainians in the game right here, both on the ground and in the air. The key is going to be whether or not Putin ultimately decides he wants to get to a ceasefire. So far, I'm not seeing anything that makes me confident of that.
Well, Beth, on this front, when you look at this and knowing, as someone who studies Putin and what he does and his tactics, do you think he's just trying to stall for time here?
There's stalling, but there's also positioning. One of the things that I really took away from the Kremlin readout was how much this is framed as two great men who are running great powers, and our role is to have this global responsibility. And so all of this is about rehabilitating Putin, bringing him back into the international community, and being seen at home as being very, very strong. And I think that he is actually succeeding in these ways.
Well, is that part of it? When at the end of the readout, they talked about hockey and having the United States and Russia play hockey again, and rearranging those games. I mean, is that part of that? Is that kind of a sports washing of what we've seen happen with Russia?
I just keep wondering who is Ovechkin going to play for. But yeah, sure, it's a sports. It's a sports washing. It's an everything washing. It is, and we're helping because we are equivocating in our statement. Russia and Ukraine, this war should never started. There is literally zero penalty for Putin saying no.
Yeah, and Admiral Stavridis, when it comes to Zelensky and the Europeans here and what this looks like, I mean, Zelensky, we haven't seen the Ukrainians say, yes, we'll agree to this halt on attacks on energy and infrastructure. What does that look like?
Well, first and foremost, we recognize our greatest comparative advantage here over Russia is the fact that we have allies. We have allies, partners, and friends around the world, including NATO. And by the way, if we want to play hockey with the Russians, we better keep the Canadians on our side, not drive them away. So here's the point. What the Europeans need to do is to step in, lean in, make the administration understand that they ought to have a seat at this table. They're contributing more money, more capability, more capacity to the Ukrainians than the United States is. So Beth is right. The Russians, and so far the U.S. are trying to position this as two great men conducting great power politics. Europe is a very powerful factor. We ought to be trying to pull them into this conversation. It can only lend weight to our side of the equation.
We'll see what that looks like. Admiral Stavridis and Beth Sanner, great to have you both and your expertise.